So Darin and I are really excited to be able to share with you all some information about this violence prevention capacity building program. Our hope today is to be able to go a little bit more in depth on the RFA and then have an opportunity for folks to ask questions that we might be able to answer today. And if not, we're putting together an FAQ, which we'll talk about more at the end of our time together today, with all the questions that folks ask so that we can be sure to provide as much information as possible to folks as you're getting ready to apply for these funds. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of give an overview of the RFA, talk a little bit more in depth on ways to apply, the purposes of these funds, eligibility, et cetera. And then we'll be able to have an opportunity for folks to ask questions. I'm going to pause real quick because I see that there's a question that someone's not able to see the sign language interpreter, and I want to make sure that we get that squared away before we continue.
I just spotlighted Sarah. Can the person who offered that feedback let us know if anything changed on their end? You see them now? Okay, thank you so much for that feedback. We really appreciate that. As we're moving through this, just want to add, if anyone needs, or if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or use the Q&A function. We may not be able to get to them till the end, but I understand it might be helpful to write them down at the time.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and jump in if that sounds good to you, Darin.
Sounds great.
All right. So quick little overview on the ARPA prevention funding. The goal of this funding is to support community-based prevention in organizations with a demonstrated commitment to domestic and sexual violence prevention. Our goal here is really to be able to bring in additional flexible funds that communities and organizations can use to lead prevention work and build capacity within their organizations and communities to carry out prevention efforts. The timeline for these fundings is the RFA was released last week on Wednesday. The application will be due December 9th. And the funding activities are in a 2-year cycle, so it'll be during 2003 and 2004. For these funds, there's a total of $253,000 that's available total, and each organization and community is able to apply for up to $30,000. And in a little bit, we'll be talking about the different pathways for applying for funding, and we'll talk a little bit about the different ways that the funding will be broken down.
All right, so one of the things that we wanted to do was to do two things at once with this funding. One was provide folks with some frameworks so that they can understand, what this can look like, what building capacity for community-based prevention can look like. And we wanted to provide some flexibility so that organizations and the communities that they serve can determine what the best pathway for prevention is for themselves. So what we have are 4 potential pathways to do prevention work through this grant. And when I say 4, I really mean potentially infinite, because the 4th one, as you can see, is choose your own adventure. So I'll start with number 1. And that is relationship and network building. So this includes any sort of prevention activities that might involve strengthening your existing partnerships, pursuing new partnerships with allied organizations, allied individuals, community members, community groups, with the intent to increase capacity for your organization to engage in prevention work. So this might include some sort of partnership with an organization where you're doing prevention in the community together. It might include building a community coalition One thing that folks might be familiar with is sexual assault response team or DV fatality review boards when it comes to responses to violence and some of the ways that our organizations support that. Um, One option might be to think about what that might look like if it was done in terms of prevention to bring various stakeholders together in a community um, to build a bit of a coalition around prevention. So those are some options. We really want folks to think about what's out there in the community and what relationships we can build to strengthen our organizations and our work. The second pathway here is organizational preparedness. And so this includes activities that increase an organization's capacity to do long-term sustainable and effective prevention work. So this could include professional development, training, and capacity building around prevention. It could also include those sorts of activities that in a way that's related to things that are adjacent to prevention. So if your organization, for example, does anti-racism work internally or does equity work or LGBTQ equity work as examples, that's going to strengthen your ability to do prevention work in your community. So anything in terms of your organization that helps the organization build up that capacity will sort of fall under that pathway. And the third is strengthening your ongoing prevention work. So thinking about what you're currently doing and ways that we can strengthen that work, build that capacity, whether it includes adding staff, whether that includes adding a component to your work. For example, if you're doing school-based curricula in the classroom, but you're not working with the teachers and doing professional development with the teachers, that might be one way that you can strengthen that work. That's pathway number 3. And then number 4, as I mentioned earlier, is choose your own adventure. And so we really want folks to get creative, and we really, again, we don't want to tell folks what's best for their communities. We want you to identify and determine what the best prevention work for your community is alongside your community. And so this pathway gives you that opportunity to propose activities that you think or that you know will work in your community.
So next, we're going to chat a little bit about some of the factors that will be considered when awarding applications. And these are some of the factors that the review committee will be considering when making recommendations on projects to fund. So the first factor that's going to be considered is that it's community-led. So what we're talking about here is prevention efforts and capacity building that is by and for communities. And specifically, applications that are by and for the following communities will be prioritized: Black people, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color, sex workers, people who are currently and formerly incarcerated, trans, two-spirit, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, queer people, disabled people, youth with developmental and physical disabilities, people who are immigrants and refugees, people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and people belonging to other communities who are most impacted by systems of oppression. And so here when we're talking about community-led, going back to that by and for, we're really looking at the ways that community is involved in leading all parts of this work, from the brainstorming of what projects might want to be implemented, to creating that, to the evaluation, really having community be a part and leading all the different components of this work. The next thing that we're looking at is that this is collaborative work. This can be strengthening community and organizational relationships, as Darin talked on the previous slide about ways to strengthen those relationships to increase capacity for prevention. And then we're also looking at ways that applications are identifying and striving to address root causes of violence. And here we're really looking at how root causes of violence are being identified by communities who are leading this work. This doesn't necessarily have to be that the CDC or some other documented academic journal with data is identifying problems. These can be problems, these can be issues, root causes of violence that communities know to be true and have identified for themselves. And as Darin talked a little bit on the previous slide too, what we're really looking for are alternatives to dominant culture, one size fits all prevention. We're really encouraging folks to be creative and having communities getting to lead what prevention looks like for them, and not what dominant culture prevention has said prevention is historically and currently.
So in terms of eligibility, the folks who are eligible to apply include 501c3 community-based sexual violence and dual OCATSVA member programs. It also includes 501c3 culturally specific programs that are working to end sexual violence in Oregon. And finally, it includes tribal programs. We're currently working with DAS, the Department of Administrative Services, who this funding passes through to explore the possibility of funding programs that are fiscally sponsored by a 501c3. We're hoping to have that information by the end of this week, and then we'll be posting an FAQ with more information next week. And then if it is allowed, then we will be updating the funding announcement to include that information. But essentially, organizations that do sexual violence response work, sexual violence prevention work, OCASVA member programs, culturally specific programs, and tribal programs are eligible for this funding. We have received a question from somebody who was wondering if community colleges can apply for these funds. And what we told them was that although they can't apply directly based on this eligibility criteria, as Meagan mentioned earlier, we are looking, one of the things that we're prioritizing is collaboration. And so one thing that we're really encouraging are partnerships and collaborations in this work. So one option, if you are a part of an organization or a group that does not appear eligible, is to identify a potential 501c3 community partner or another eligible entity, and create an MOU and create a partnership in applying for these funds. And if anyone has more questions about that, then they can, if anyone's interested in going in that direction and has questions about the process of establishing an MOU or something like that, then myself and Meagan can provide them support around that.
All right, so some deadlines that we wanted to review. So the deadline for completing the application again is going to be December 9th of this year. You'll see this in the FAQ, but one of the reasons why this deadline is a little bit over a month from the date of the RFA being released is that we want to be able to get these funds into communities and programs as soon as possible, as they have to be spent down by December of 24. And so we had hoped that we could have this application period open for longer to be able to allow for folks to have more opportunity and time to apply for the funds. However, when we really looked at the timeline and when we would be able to have reviewers review applications and get funds into communities and organizations, we wanted to prioritize being able to make that happen. As Darin mentioned, if you have questions or things that are coming up while you're applying for these funds, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit around resources for support. If for some reason deadline or timing is feeling very hard for you, please reach out so that we can chat about ways to support you and ensuring that you can get your application in on time. We really want to make these funds and these monies as accessible as possible for folks. So deadline for completing is December 9th. As we've mentioned, we will have a committee of reviewers who will be selected based on their knowledge and expertise in community-driven violence prevention, who will be reviewing the applications and providing recommendations for awards. Applicants will be notified in early January of 2023 on award status. And then the first year for timeline of activities is January 23 to December 23. And the second year will be January 24 to December 24. And you'll see noted in the RFA that part of the timeline, or included in the activities, is also ongoing support from the task force and the coalition, as well as opportunities to participate in community and organizational convenings that are happening already. And so the task force currently leads, I believe it's bi-monthly, or it might be 4 times a year, meetings for folks who are engaged in prevention. And so that support and those opportunities will be available to these awardees as well.
So the applications can be submitted in a number of different ways. We want folks to do what feels best for them. And so sometimes what feels best is submitting an application online and going through kind of a standard application form. And sometimes that's not the best way. So of course, like I said, we have that basic online form that folks can use by opening up the funding announcement and clicking the link to apply. But you can also apply via pre-recorded video, or you can apply during a recorded online meeting that you schedule with us, and we'll go through some of the questions with you. And so those are all options. In our FAQ that we put out next week, we will include some instructions for people who may be interested in doing a pre-recorded video but aren't sure what the best way to upload that and get that to us will be. Folks don't have to use the process that we outline in the FAQ, but we will be offering an example for people. And again, we're definitely encouraging folks, if it's helpful, please reach out and we can provide some technical support around recording that video or doing an online meeting. There's more information in the funding announcement about the application and the various questions and whatnot.
And so a little bit more about the application process specific to the project narrative. And when you take a look at the full RFA, which Darin has linked in the chat, you'll be able to read in detail these questions. The application process, whether you do it via video, recorded meeting, or on SurveyMonkey, the project narrative questions are the same. And so those questions include sharing with us a little bit about your organizational equity and or anti-oppression plan and or experience, training in anti-oppression, anti-racism, cultural humility, and other relevant frameworks for promoting equitable access, opportunities, and or outcomes within your work. And what we're looking for here is both internally and in community settings. What does this look like? And one thing that you'll see in the RFA, which I believe Darin had mentioned earlier too, is if while you're working on this description, you're realizing that the work that you're doing does not reflect significant planning, experience, and or training around this work, we really then recommend that your application include related activities to address those gaps in particular. If while you're working on it, you're struggling to kind of figure out, like, have we done work that we're feeling is robust in this area? Is there giant gaps that we're having? Again, you can connect with us. We'll also talk about other opportunities to connect with folks for technical assistance. But I think regardless of if you feel already like you have a strong footing in this or not within your community and your organization, these are parts of your application that we're really interested in learning more about the efforts you're currently doing and your plan for efforts in the future. Next piece here is we're interested in knowing a little bit more about your current staffing capacity and or resources for prevention efforts. if you currently are not in a place where your organization or your community has a lot of capacity around prevention or resources, don't be concerned that that is going to mark you down in your application or mean that you're not set up in a place to receive these funds. As Darin talked about earlier, around the 4 different pathways for applying, including choose your own adventure, growing that capacity, being able to outline how you want to grow your staffing and resources is a super viable use of these funds, and we would be excited to explore being able to support you in that. Excuse me. The next part is a description of the project proposal for building capacity for prevention efforts. So we want to hear a little bit more about what your plan is, what that includes, who your community partners might be, so on and so forth. Next, we're interested in description of the steps you will take to measure effectiveness and identify areas of improvement, which also is normally talked about as evaluation, right? But we don't want you to feel like it has to be, as we talked about earlier, evaluation in the sense of mainstream dominant culture prevention evaluation and what that has looked like previously or historically and currently, but really what will it mean to be able to measure effectiveness and areas for improvement in the work that you're doing. And so you can get really creative in how your evaluation methods might look. The next piece in there is there's some supplemental questions depending on which pathway you're interested in applying. And again, you are welcome to apply under 1, 2, 3, or all 4 pathways. You can use them in combination. You can in year 1 be really focused on one pathway, and then in year 2 want to focus on a different pathway that builds off of that. And so depending on what pathways you're wanting to apply under, there's some supplemental questions there that we're going to ask you to include responses to. The next piece there is the total amount that you are requesting to be funded, as well as a budget. And there is a link within the RFA with a sample budget that we welcome folks to use. You don't have to use this sample budget in your application. You are welcome to use a different budget. We just want to be able to provide a sample for you if that is something that would be helpful. And then from there, we're also going to ask you to upload a timeline of your activities and tell us a little bit more about what your timeline is going to look like. And then we have a couple of required additional application documents as well. So a cover letter signed by an authorized signer from your organization or community that includes verification of your non-discrimination policy, as well as verification of your tax-exempt status. If for some reason being able to access these additional documents is a barrier to applying, please let us know. So if you're within a community organization that doesn't currently have these and you're interested in applying for the funds, reach out, let us know. We don't want that to be a barrier for application, and we can explore different ways for you to be able to still access this application.
So the review process will take place in December and potentially the very, very first part of January. A committee of reviewers will evaluate the factors that are discussed on slide 4 that Meagan talked about. So that being community-led, collaborative, and addressing root causes. And so those are the factors that they're really going to be highlighting in determining and making recommendations for awards. We are currently in the process of putting together this review committee. So be on the lookout for information if you're interested in opportunities with compensation to participate in the review committee. One thing that I do want to mention that I think may not be clear, I think on the first slide that we said that the amount of funding is up to $30,000. That is up to $30,000 per year that folks can apply for. And what we anticipate doing is funding probably a couple of programs around that 30,000 mark, and then a few programs around the 15 or so thousand mark. But it will be somewhere around those. So we can't exactly say how many programs will be funding because that depends on the applications we get and the funding that's requested. But that's currently what we anticipate is a couple of organizations receiving a larger pot, and then a couple of organizations receiving smaller pots of funding.
And so support is available if you are needing it while you're working on your application. You are more than welcome to contact Darin and myself with any questions that you might have, or if you need support navigating the application process. Additionally, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, NSVRC, their prevention team is available to provide assistance during the application process, subject to their availability. And you can contact Jen Grove at jgrove@nsvrc.org to schedule some time for technical assistance and support from their prevention team. And at this time, I believe we want to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Darin.
Oh, no worries. I was probably going to say exactly what you were going to say, which is this is a great time to open the floor for questions. Feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom. I'm not entirely sure if in this webinar format people can unmute and speak directly to us. I believe they might be able to ask to unmute. So feel free to do that, or type in the chat that you have a question, and I can make it so that you're able to talk on this webinar format. So again, feel free to use the Q&A, feel free to use the chat, or let us know and we'll unmute you. I am seeing the question of if it's possible to get a recording of this webinar. Absolutely. We will be, I believe we will be publishing this recording at the same time that the FAQ goes live. So that'll be early next week. We're aiming for Monday. So keep an eye out for that coming out on Monday. I see the question, will you receive a recording of this webinar in your email? I think that depends on how you originally found this webinar or the funding announcement. We will be sending it out to the same channels that we sent this funding announcement out to in the first place. So the SATF listserv, I believe I sent it out to the SATF Prevention Committee, and then Meagan sent it out to a number of different listservs and newsletters on the OCATSVA side as well.
And I just dropped into the chat, Darin, and my email addresses if you need to get in contact with us, if you have follow-up questions, if you want to connect around anything else related to these funds or prevention in general. So you're welcome to contact us via email.
Yeah, and I recommend folks reach out to both of us. That will allow us to have the quicker response, because then the two of us can kind of coordinate which one of us is in the best position to respond. Katrina, I see that your hand has gone up. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free.
Sure. Just quick question. I don't see an email, your email information in my chat.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. I think that went to hosts and panelists. Thank you for letting us know. Do you see it now?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you. As we mentioned, folks can email us if you have any questions as you're navigating the application process. If you need any support around this, please reach out to us. If you have questions around your prevention strategy, again, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has a prevention team available to provide assistance. So I definitely encourage reaching out to them. They have looked at the funding announcement, they've spoken to us, and they have a sense of what sort of prevention we're looking to fund with this grant, and can kind of help you if you're in that process of figuring out what you want your prevention work to look like. And just so folks know, although it is the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, if folks are doing a DV specific project, they should still be able to provide some support to you around that. And they're connected to other organizations like NRCDV, which is a national domestic violence organization, and may be able to refer you if they weren't the best people to answer your question. But again, I'm pretty confident in their ability to support both sexual assault and domestic violence prevention work.
Within the RFA, also another thing that I'll mention is at the end of the RFA, you'll see a list of resources. And so these are a list of resources that were compiled by Darin, myself, as well as we forgot to mention, we had a really incredible committee of folks who helped us to put together this application. So this was put together by a number of folks across the state in collaboration together. And so really encourage you to check out those resources that are at the end of the RFA, because they'll be helpful to your application and your prevention efforts in general.
Yeah, and please reach out if you have any questions. Send us an email. If you have a question, there's a good chance that somebody else has it, and it might be useful for us to include it in our FAQ. So we really appreciate folks reaching out and asking us questions and identifying where there might be gaps and whatnot. So please reach out if there's any way that we can support you. All right, well, I think that is the information that we planned on presenting to folks today. Again, this recording and an FAQ will be coming out next week, and we'll be publishing that in the same places that we put out the funding announcements. Again, please feel free to reach out to us. My email is Darin, D-A-R-I-N, @OregonSATF.org. And Meagan is Meagan, M-E-A-G-A-N, @OCADSV.org. So feel free to reach out.